And we are recording with Mr. Richard Rhodes on Monday, February 19th, 2024 at 12:28 p.m. Eastern Time. And I read the couple chapters that you sent me of your book, but I know you said it's not going to be published for quite some time. So if the thumbnail seems misleading, we don't talk about that. That's why I made the thumbnail, and then you said it wasn't going to be ready for some time. So I did read it. The
Uh-huh.
90,000 Babies of Dr. Joe, and the Typhoid Mary, and all of it was fascinating. And just kind of looking back then, even just, I mean, yeah, the idea of how much, how different it was, just the social pressures of, I'm a cook for a wealthy family. You're separated,
Yes,
you're preparing the food, you're away from all the dirty peasants, all the unwashed masses, probably my ancestors, all the Irish. But
certainly mine.
yeah, oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, hey, you've been on here several times before. I mean, I think most well known, probably Making of the Atomic Bomb. Probably the one book of yours we haven't discussed. But my favorites probably Dark Sun, as well as Energy. Scientist, we've gone over. Oh, and the Masters of Death, SS Einsatzgruppe, group, and I probably cite that episode. It's probably one of the top five episodes I cite. Just kind of lessons learned. But um, I do think it's also probably equally interesting, is you said the vagaries or the vagaries of this industry of being an author. And I do think it's interesting in just terms of like pivoting. You were working on a book about particle physics, and now it's about,
Right.
yeah, like infant mortality. So that alone is a wild, what led to that jump?
The particle physics book was suggested by my editor at Doubleday. He was interested in this giant machine in Geneva, Switzerland, called the Large Hadron Collider, which is a 17-kilometer circumference particle accelerator. The one where they famously discovered something called the
The Higgs
Higgs
boson,
boson
yeah.
back in 2012. Uh, And it was fascinating. And I went over to Switzerland and stood inside this giant machine when they had it shut down for maintenance at Christmas time. But when you start looking at particle physics, there's very little to say about it, other than that this particle was discovered, and then this particle was discovered, and then this particle was discovered. And slowly you get to the point where all the particles supposedly have been discovered. The Higgs, I mean, been presumed to be the last one. And there was nothing there really to talk about. Furthermore, the whole thing has come to a kind of dead end.
Hmm.
Back when I first won a Pulitzer, the Sloan Foundation, uh, as a kind of reward, offered me a grant for a couple of years research at MIT and Harvard. And I moved from Kansas City, where I grew up and lived, with my wife Ginger to the East Coast. We lived in Cambridge, a terrible place, I must say. Uh, it's like living in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's just terribly cold.
Yeah, I
You
know.
feel like you're a cod.
I'm in
It's,
I'm in Maine right now. Yeah, no, you're telling me.
oh my God, yes,
Yeah.
you know. Anyway, uh, my landlord at the house we rented in Cambridge was Stephen Weinberg, a really brilliant Nobel laureate theoretical physicist, although I would have to say on the side he didn't know enough to keep his furnace clean.
No.
But so much for brilliance. Anyway,
And yeah, and to become a
Weinberg himself, I discovered, had left the field of his work in particle physics around 2015 because he thought it was a dead end and had switched over to cosmology, which was the really lively and still is field of theoretical physics these days, how the universe works, basically. I thought that was justification for changing subjects. But when you make a deal with a publisher to write a book, there is normally money paid up front. It's called an advance. And it's basically a kind of a no interest loan against the royalties that are expected to be earned back when the book is finally published. Uh, And it's also nice in that if the book doesn't earn back any royalties or not enough to cover the advance, you don't have to pay the advance back. But if you decide not to write a book, you don't turn in a finished book, you are supposed to pay the advance back. And my advances are a year's income. So that would have been very painful. So
Mm,
my next task was to find another book
yeah.
that would interest Doubleday equally as much and basically do a swap. And that's when I came across in my, I have a, the old mountain men used to have a leather bag they carried around. They called it their possibles kit. And in it, they had a flint and the things they needed to survive from one place to another as they went out trapping beaver and all the things they did. So I had a possible kit of ideas for possible books.
Mm,
And I dug around in my possibles kit and I found one. Well, the general subject of public health, which has interested me for a very long time, because I think ultimately we're going to get past all the violence that we live with by using the methodologies of public health. It won't be quite the same as tracking down diseases and controlling them, but it will be similar in a lot of ways. Looking for the cause, looking for the first case, seeing how it spreads, seeing if there's a way to interdict the spreading. You can see how that could apply to gun violence and the general dispersion of violent socialization. We've talked about that before. Uh, so public health has always been an interest of mine, and I've always wanted to do a book on the history of public health. And I've never found an editor who thought that sounded interesting at all.
mm,
But suddenly I realized I had that story in the form of a really interesting woman who lived at the turn of the 20th century. I think she actually died in 45. She was born around 1880. But she was an early pioneer of public health in New York City when New York was dealing with the extraordinary amount of disease that was there because of all the immigrants who had packed into these god awful buildings called tenements, 10 or 12 to a room sometimes, with almost many of the rooms didn't even have windows. So they were just hellholes to live in with the toilets out in the backyard and some of the early tenements they dumped all the manure in the basement or they raised hogs in the basement.
good
it was
Lord.
it was just terrible, and of course there was endless amounts of disease, particularly typhoid, which is spread by contaminated water or contaminated feces or anything that's got typhoid germs in it, that's including ice cream in the case of typhoid Mary, the cook you mentioned.
Mm,
Typhoid Mary, the typhoid bacteria is killed by pasteurization, for example. Eating something to about 140, 150 degrees will kill the bacteria. So it wasn't her cooking in the kitchen, but in the summertime, she made ice cream for her wealthy patrons. And that's what got them. So she would go work at a house. And about 3 weeks later, people in the family would start coming down with typhoid. And no one knew where it came from. And then she would quietly leave that job and go to another one. And they would suddenly start coming down with typhoid. So she was a great and classic story that involved this doctor, Dr. Joe Baker, uh, Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker. She also was an interesting person in her own right. She was gay. Her partner for part of her life was a extraordinarily successful novelist and screenwriter and wrote some of the great classic movies of the early 1940s. They were members of a club in Greenwich Village called Heterodoxy, which was partly gay women, partly straight women, but women who wanted to get away from the goddamn men for a while and just sit and smoke cigarettes and flirt and talk about politics. So, so here are all these wonderful pieces of this story all coming together into this one person. Unfortunately, my editors at Doubleday saw that this was a really good story. I mean, what a film this would make.
yeah.
If anybody's out there who wants to do an early option on a movie, I'm here.
He's all ears.
So they happily made the switch, and off went the particle physics book to some other soul.
Well, I think
But this shows you how awkward it can be when you're in the business of writing books for a living to make it all happen. I mean, you're really living by your wits.
Mm,
And there are a lot of constraints that are built into the process of negotiating what you want to do before you've actually done it.
mm. Yeah, it's well, I mean, in terms of the publisher being interested, I think I think anyone worth their salt and be it being an author or a professor is if they're good enough, you can make anything interesting. And I'll cite historian Dan Carlin, Hardcore History, his podcast. He talks about World War. I'd never really learned about World War One because it just didn't seem as fascinating as World War Two. And he did a 6-part podcast, 6-part, 4 hours each, called Blueprints for
Huh.
Armageddon. And it's
Well,
not an audiobook, but it in terms of just an audio presentation, it's easily top 1% of audiobooks I've ever read. It's fascinating.
uh,
And he just takes it and he just makes it, he covers a lot of ancient history, but I mean he did Cuban Missile Crisis, same thing. The point is you can make it interesting. And I think for it to be interesting though, is you, the content creator, there has to be a genuine fascination. And I think with particle physics, it does seem like a dead end in that, I mean, to see how it would shape our world, the only possible thing I can think of is some
yeah.
exotic form of space travel. Somehow they've learned, how to move mass at the speed of light or something. But other than that, it's not the same as, Moore's Law. It's not getting computer chips smaller and smaller to where even the
Right.
uneducated
Right.
layman like myself, I can see I go, oh, that's why we have the iPhone 15 and why it's so different than the iPhone 10 versus something like public health. You can kind of sink your teeth into it. You can look at it,
Oh,
especially in
yeah.
the light of COVID, and you can see how that shapes our world. And I mean, even just things like cities, even just living in an apartment building myself is you can see how it wasn't always the case that everything was hunky dory. I mean, Manhattan pre Model T, right? Is just I think you talked
Oh,
about the amount of urine and manure from yeah, it's like the car's shit. It was
yeah.
their
Right.
horses. So
Well, people, one of the stories I love, which is actually in my book Energy, but I've kind of relocated a version of it into this new book, is that there were in Manhattan alone, which is about, if I remember right, 23 square miles in size, there were more than 130,000 horses because horses pulled everything at that time. 100, the volume of manure that was produced daily was something like 100 tons. The volume, each horse produces about 50 pounds of manure a day and about 1 gallon of urine. And all of that had to be cleaned out of the city. For a long time, there was a good solution because the farmers all around New York City would buy the manure, which was cleaned out every day by the what are they called? The people who clean the streets, street sweepers would pick all that up and also from all of the stables and cart it out to the farmers in New Jersey and in New York, and it would be used to grow the food that fed the people in the city. So there was a lovely little
hmm,
feedback cycle going on that kept the place clean. But somewhere along around the 1840s, there was discovered down off the coast of Peru some islands that were covered with guano, which is bird manure,
mm-hmm,
covered to a depth of hundreds of feet. They traced, someone did a study of it and traced the earliest layer back to about 200 BC.
ooh,
So you can imagine these were islands where birds nested, and it just kept piling up and piling up and piling up. Once and the whaling ships of the day usually had to return if they didn't catch a whale, which got to be harder and harder as the whales got knocked off. I love these cycles of weird
mm,
things, but they work together. The whaling ships, if they didn't catch a whale, didn't want to come back to the East Coast with their empty.
yeah,
They wanted some kind cargo. So they started loading the holds of their ships with this beautiful, rich, aged. It looked and but didn't smell like fine cheddar cheese, actually.
Oh,
So they they loaded the holds with this stuff and brought it back to the East Coast. It was higher intensity nitrogen. It was much more portable than horse manure. And at just around that time, people began to realize that all the flies that were generated by all the horse manure were carrying disease. So flies, which before around 1850 had been considered these cute little buzzy things that seemed to just have happy little gay lives, suddenly flies became a menace. And you'd find these cartoons in newspapers showing flies with their front has a hypodermic needle
mm-hmm.
carrying a disease organism into you. All of a sudden, they couldn't get rid of all of this manure, and the city just piled up with it. There are photographs of streets in Greenwich Village where the manure is higher than the curbs,
Oh,
honestly.
God.
And it became yet another terrible problem the city had to deal with. People, the people who fantasized that the past was this lovely sort of Edenic world where people lived simple lives, forget about all the disease. They forget about all of the kind of rural bathroom equalities that existed when our energy source was animals.
I,
It makes for a very strange and interesting story.
I, I, I know it's a strong word, but I hate those people. I hate the. I always want. I love going back and looking at YouTube videos where people will take old film from like 1902 and they'll use AI to upscale it to 4K and 60 frames per second,
Yeah,
and then they'll add in audio, and it's normally just like horse clopping on on the road. But it's really
right.
fascinating to go back and look at 1898 Manhattan, and you see people walking around, and I always it's maybe it's a personal problem, but I get so irrationally angry when you look at the top comments on YouTube. There'll be 10,000 likes, and it'll be like, "Not a phone in sight. Everyone dressed to the nines." And it's like dressed to the nines because they had one piece of clothing, and it was a suit that they probably
Right.
got from their dad, who they got from their dad. And there's no phones because phones didn't exist. And the reality is half
Right.
these kids died in World War I, and the other half died in World War II. And if those didn't get them, they died
Yeah.
from disease. And for every kid you see walking around, there's 9 stillbirths. Though it's not an idyllic. Maybe maybe I can maybe kind of understand idealizing Native Americans, where it seemed like they
Yeah.
really were in sync with nature, even though they died much younger. But yeah, idealizing the turn of the century in cities, it just
Right.
you can tell
You know,
it gets my blood pressure up. It's awful.
cities they were just cesspools. They truly were.
Yeah.
It was only in 1850 that New York finally passed an ordinance that you couldn't run pigs in the streets. So, so just think about that for a while. Cattle, if a horse died in harness, they would just leave it there. They wouldn't try to drag it off the street. The guy who owned the horse, I mean, he just unharnessed the dead horse and let it flop down. And that was for the city to worry about. So the conditions were just terrible.
But
And here's a number for you that I find really telling.
okay.
In 1800, in New York City, 47% of all newborns died before their first year
47.
of life ended. 47, half. That means everyone who had a baby, they knew this baby had a 50% chance of dying before it was a year old of some disease because the milk was polluted. The farmers, before bacteria, nobody knew what caused all this stuff anyway. But even when that began to be clear, farmers around New York still produced the milk under distinctly unhygienic conditions, put it in milk cans or barrels, shipped it to New York, where it was poured into open wooden barrels in grocery stores, in corner stores. And then if you wanted some milk for your child in the summer, you would take a jug or a pitcher or whatever you had, a bucket, down to the store and dip it into this open, which was surrounded with a cloud of flies in the summer. and then you'd take that milk back and you'd feed your child. And the flies, of course, were living on the horse manure. So, of course, the typhoid rate and diphtheria rate and all of those diseases that I vaguely remember from my childhood, having been born in 1937, you know, tuberculosis was still around. We were still being vaccinated for smallpox. The diseases of childhood, I had measles, I had chicken pox. We had all those diseases that weren't routinely fatal because the vaccination process hadn't really come in yet for all of them. That was a development post World War II. And the most terrifying of all was polio, because every summer, uh, some city or another would have an epidemic of polio cases, and hundreds of kids would be either paralyzed or dead or lose. Well, paralysis was bad enough. Franklin Roosevelt being the
Mm-hmm.
classic example. He kept it very carefully disguised, but I knew plenty of kids who walked around with a big brace on one leg because that side of their body had been damaged by the neurotoxic effects of polio virus. So those were all part. We weren't allowed to go to the movies in the summertime because you didn't want people gathering together. I mean,
Good Lord.
everyone understands this now from COVID,
Mm-hmm.
but we had that all our childhoods during World War II and after World War II.
And
Antibiotics only came in 1943. Before that, the only antibiotic and in very small quantities was sulfa, which was one of the first antibiotics invented. Penicillin came in the middle of the war when they finally developed a way to manufacture it in large quantities. And it saved a lot of our sailors and soldiers' lives, of course. But it's only recently in my lifetime that these things have actually changed all that much. And now we have the phenomenon of people saying, oh, we don't want to vaccinate our children. They might get autism. Honest to Christ.
it is,
I cannot tell you how angry that makes me.
and it sounds cold, and I don't mean to, but it's Darwinian, is what it is, and it's. But to even
Mm,
go as a bit of a meta zooming out, and I hope your publisher's watching, is this is again though back to the beginning is why this is a worthwhile story. It's affected your life.
yeah.
We can still see in our lives now the difference. I mean, I went to Manhattan to see a therapist every week for like a year or two. It's 2016, 2017. And yeah, even just kind of driving in there, it being packed to the gills, but you never want. I mean, the problem was is it would kind of give you anxiety because the drivers are insane and there's so many people, and it's very unnatural. It's you're in kind of these man-made canyons, but other than that, there's no like worry that I'm gonna die of some disease. And it's you can see how that affects us. Even like 47%. That's such an insane number. Or what is it? The Jungle by Upton
Yeah.
Sinclair. That was 1901 or 1902 about the
Yeah.
meatpacking
That was
industry in Chicago. Yeah, you can
part
really,
of the same era.
yeah, you can see how it really has affected our life. I mean, you still see horses in Manhattan, but they're a novelty. It's people on some,
Yeah.
yeah, like carriage, some Valentine's Day thing. But it
Or
was,
riding in Central Park.
yeah. But
That's the
again,
real.
it's a
Yeah.
romantic novelty. And
Yeah.
it's just madness versus particle physics. And this is probably going to age very poorly because knowing our luck, you're going to stop doing a book and I'm going to sit here and talk down about it. And next week, there's going to be some breakthrough that fundamentally changes all of our lives. And I'm going to look like I'm going to be the equivalent of somebody saying the internet's just a fad. But there's really kind of no, we're zooming in and we're zooming in and we're zooming in. And it doesn't seem like we're working towards anything. It just seems to be really fine tuning, and it's kind of depressing. It just goes nowhere. But versus public health, and maybe COVID has changed that dramatically. But it's made us, I think, all aware of that we do live at the very end, not very end, but the very latest manifestation of health. Like this Cities are possible.
Well,
International air
I
travel is
think,
possible.
yeah, yeah. I think that people don't realize, especially the anti-vaxxers, for example, that public health is a continuing process.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't end when you develop a vaccine because new variants evolve, as we now have learned to our considerable loss, more than 1 million American lives lost, right, in the last 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Strangely invisible. I still wonder where everybody went. I mean, I didn't see a funeral in every street. And yet somehow we lost some. I guess it speaks to the size of the
Well,
country.
yeah,
I don't know.
350 million. I think I knew one person that died from COVID. Yeah.
Yeah. But the point is, it's a continual adjustment between our world and the natural world that has to be maintained. You see that in war when these things break down
Mm,
and suddenly typhus reemerges. Jesus God,
yeah.
when was the last time you knew anyone who had typhus, which is spread by little bugs, basically, or typhoid from bad water. That turns up once in a blue moon because somebody who was infected with typhoid cut into a watermelon and then everybody ate some of the watermelon and you have a little outbreak somewhere. We've got polio down to almost zero throughout the entire world now. But if we didn't continually monitor, and that's my point about all of this, public health isn't something that you fix and then it's fixed. It's an ongoing process that keeps us alive. And as such, endlessly interesting and fascinating to write about from my point of view.
Mm,
And the potential I see, if I can ever find a publisher who's interested in my writing a book about it, the potential for using the methodologies of public health to eliminate violent behavior.
mm,
I mean, just Kansas City's my hometown. Kansas City's never going to be the same to all those cheering Chiefs fans who were down at Union
mm,
Station that day when these two punk kids decided to spray bullets at each other. But one of the things I know from writing about violence is if those kids didn't have guns, they wouldn't have been able to do that.
mm.
I know gun control is a big issue in the United States. So I'll just take the example of Australia.
Sure.
When that guy shot up the synagogue in Australia and knocked off dozens and dozens of people, Australia got serious about gun control and just basically got rid of guns.
Mm,
They don't have those events anymore. So much as I do believe, oh, I know the other thing I wanted to say. Kansas, Missouri is an open carry, and you can carry anything you want anywhere, hidden or exposed. So there must have been a lot of people in the crowd who had weapons with them. And what took down the wrong guy who happened to have a gun on him? Someone tackled him. He
jeez.
didn't shoot him, they tackled him. I mean, yeah, what do you do under those circumstances? The last thing you do, I hope, is start spraying bullets like the guys who are doing the shooting.
Mm.
It's a big subject, and I don't want to offend your
No,
audience
no,
who
no, no.
believe in guns, but surely we don't believe in mass killing.
No, you should offend. You know, and I'm not being sarcastic when I say that. You should offend. I don't have on guests to agree or disagree with me. I have on guests who are interesting, and whether or not I agree or disagree, or my audience agrees or disagrees, is not my. It's really not my concern. It's for you to, I don't want everyone someone to come on and curtail what they say or tailor what they. If I want, I friends and family will always give me positive feedback because they're friends and family. They'll say, great podcast. Just like I'll say, hey, whatever, great color of your new car. But, for me personally, I want to hear people and hear what they actually have to say. So if someone doesn't agree, that's fine. But I think it's fascinating to hear everyone's point of view. And so don't worry about offending them. People are offended. It doesn't matter. Who cares? I think it's fascinating
Well,
to use public health for that.
let me just add to that. I certainly can agree with the sentiment that says guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Sure.
In this wise, the system that I foresee dealing with human violence would take place in the process of someone being socialized to be violent
Mm,
rather than when they finally begin to use serious violence.
mm,
There is a complicated process. I think we've talked about this before. And it showed up, of course, in the Einsatzgruppen when we had that discussion. If you interdict that process at any point along the way, it's possible in most instances to prevent someone from becoming prepared to use serious violence as a way to settle a dispute.
mm,
And the problem with guns, the unique problem with guns, is that it makes it possible for people who would not dare attack a serious opponent, someone they know is violent, with their bare hands or even with a knife. But it's so easy with the gun, as I think these two kids showed. Kansas City has one of the highest uh, gun homicide rates in the United States. It's one of the top 4 cities in the country. And that's probably in part because people who would otherwise not dare take the final steps toward becoming seriously violent, which is to challenge someone who threatens them with serious violence and then to take the risk of using it.
mm,
Because remember, if you attack someone with the intention of hitting them on the head with a brick, you don't know what they're going to do to you.
mm,
So becoming seriously violent, deciding to use serious violence is a very deep and profound decision.
mm.
That's why the notion that you could become violent by just watching things on television is so silly.
Yeah.
However much a lot of people believe it, because they aren't around violence and it looks scary to them. But the fact is, you have to use violence in order to become prepared to use violence, to have the change of mentality,
Yeah.
the change of socialization that leaves you feeling like someone violent.
Mm.
I'm always struck, here we are off on this
No,
subject,
who
but
cares?
it's
No,
to
no,
me
no,
an
no, no. Keep going.
endlessly fascinating subject. One of the things that I'm always, I won't say amused by, but saddened by, is the requirement everyone seems to have to find what they call a motive for a shooting. I mean, there may be reasons that people give you about why they did something. I don't like them because they're black or they're Jews or they're white or whatever. But the real reason we see these people performing these large acts of violence is because they receive, by doing so, violent notoriety. They become known as someone who's seriously violent. Now, it's a very short interval of success when someone then proceeds to kill themselves
Yeah.
at the end of a violent shootout. But they think beyond their own lives. They think in terms of their reputation. Becoming known as a violent person has a lot of advantages.
Oh yeah.
People get out of your way when you walk down the streets. They call you sir. They listen to you when you talk to them. And they do what you tell them by and large if they know you're
Mm.
dangerously violent. So that's the motive. And if there are decorative motives on top of that that have to do with all these issues,
Ego and
that's something else. But how many times in the course of school shootings do you find that the first people that a school shooter kills is his own parents?
yeah.
Usually that's because the parents or one parent was the person who made them violent by conditioning them to become violent, by re-socializing them to become violent. Sometimes it's because they want to, as they imagine it, spare their parents the pain and agony of having a violent child, strangely enough, but people think in all sorts of odd ways.
Mm.
But ultimately, well, there is a way to prevent this from happening before you get to the point where someone decides to use serious violence. And those are the ways that I think we need to be pursuing. That's the public health approach.
I think the public health approach is fascinating. I mean, in my, my 33 years of wisdom, not that I know what I'm talking about, but I've always thought, how much of world peace, not in the grandiose notion of utopia, but just general peace, how much of that's prevented by resource scarcity? Like, can it ever be? Sure, send a couple aircraft carrier strike groups, you're probably going to deter violence for now. I mean, how much of peace is deterred by, I mean, truly public health though. No access to clean food, clean water. You can't. One of the earliest episodes I did. This is episode 1420. One of like the first 30 episodes I did was with an IDF guy from Sire, which is their special forces, and I remember him
Well,
talking about, this is back in 2020, him understanding the suicide bomber, and I was so blown away by
yeah,
that because I was like, you must really hate them. I mean, like you're like a Jewish male in the special forces in Israel, and he was like, I think he said, along with paraphrasing, is, I have to kill them, but I understand where they're coming from. They make a nickel a month. They've never seen a toilet. They don't even know what the word dental care means. And then some wealthy financer comes along and says, shoot this RPG at that American Hummer, uh, and no matter what, your
yeah,
family will get $20,000. And if you live,
right,
you're the hero for your family. And if you die, you're out of this hellhole, and your family still gets the
yeah,
money. And
yeah,
the
yeah,
IDF guy said, I understand it. He goes, now I still have to kill them when they're going to do this. But he goes, I
sure,
understand it and I feel for it. And that still blows me away. And you think about that, and so how much of this is all it cannot be prevented, and who knows, maybe this is where particle physics come in. Maybe they make a breakthrough in fusion energy. There's limitless energy, and then there's desalinization of seawater. Who knows? But it does seem like we're almost going to hit a ceiling of possible peace when there are still things like childhood mortality, when people still in 2024, I mean, I take a multivitamin every day. How many of those things are responsible for goiters? No iodine or no vanadium or technetium or
yeah,
something
sure.
you get nanograms of. I wonder if you could tie that into public health. Is Could you start to predict
Yeah,
things?
the international version of public health would be a big one.
Mm,
I haven't even started to think about how you go about doing that
yeah.
because the fact is the world is improving. The demographic transition has now happened for every country in the world, meaning people are starting to have fewer and fewer children. The reason for 10 children, 13 children was exactly those terrible death rates for children that have continued but are slowly declining throughout the world. So we're going to reach a steady state world population. The World Health Organization estimates by 2100 it will be steady state. About as many people are born as die.
Mm,
At that point, there is a limit to this moral panic that turned around in the 20th century about population explosion. The population is no longer exploding. The explosion is slowly settling down and it's going to stop. In fact, right now we have any number of countries where people are not reproducing themselves, and it's getting to be a problem for a country like Japan, where people are mostly getting older and they don't have young people to do the work young people normally do in a society to support the elderly.
mm,
And since Japan is a country that doesn't really like foreigners, uh, it's a problem where they can't just import people from other countries. They're going to have to accept that part. In any case, we're going to reach a steady state world if we survive global warming. I mean, that's another issue.
that's a big
But
if.
let's assume we do, because we probably will. The world will be warmer, but then we'll be at a place where people can begin to be living middle class lives throughout the world. And a lot of the issues that you're talking about will not any longer be viable. And yet, on the other hand, when you think about it, we still have these god awful wars. I mean, the former Soviet Union, Russia, people aren't starving there. They don't live the lives they could live. But Putin weren't spending everything on his war. But what's he doing a war about? He's doing a war about over some half-assed idea that somehow the great Russian Empire needs to be reconstituted. Uh, Mental illness in my mind, or at least some kind of megalomania
Mm,
that defies belief. And so far he's holding his own, sadly, because none of us want to send our increasingly valuable children. They get more valuable as you have fewer and fewer, if you think of it.
Hmm.
You spend more money on them, you put them through more schooling and so forth. We don't want to send our children over there to get shot at. We're happy to a point, to spend our money and provide weapons, but and so on. It's a deep, deep dilemma, and I don't have an answer for it at even beginning. But I think, know a way that we could dramatically reduce the amount of killing that goes on in this country. And it's been going down for a long time anyway, which in itself, I think, is an indication of the transformation of our society away from poverty and want into a place where everyone at least has something close to enough.
Mm. Seems to be a general. Yeah, the it's almost it's like not a it's almost not a fun or not an entertaining answer. It's like, and I don't know if you can hear that. There's some construction people outside, but the thing that's causing less and less violence, yeah, it's kind of a it's like a natural volume almost. It's access to education, access to, like you said, enough, access to just
Yeah.
enough to where doesn't mean everyone's living like the most fulfilled or actualized life, but yeah, when you're not pushed to the absolute brink, and that's when you tend to, yeah, resort to that old reptilian brain. It's the oldest part that's like become violent when all else fails, right? Go to prison, what's the meme? The first day in prison, you got to kill the biggest guy so you get respected. That does seem to be something that comes from a almost like a desperation activation, something deep in our monkey brain.
Well, those are people who've already been made violent.
Sure.
The question is why we still have enough. For example, why are inner cities so violent? Because a lot of people in those situations don't have or don't believe they have access to alternative ways to settle disputes. Courts of law, the police, these are somehow all outside, designed basically to keep them in their ghettos rather than to help them settle disputes peacefully. So they live in a turbulent, even a malefic community. Under those circumstances, some people feel it's only right to teach your children to use violence to protect themselves, to protect you. That means you get higher rates of violence in communities that are turbulent, that don't have the kind of peaceful alternatives available that white suburban communities do. Then the only violence you usually get beyond the normal tussle over whose yard is mowed is in terms of individual families, another area where the government doesn't really have complete control and doesn't really offer alternatives for a lot of kids, where the families make someone violent because it's part of the dynamic of the politics within a family. And that's where the shooters come from.
Mm.
Wealthy families, poor families, in between families. It's it's interesting that almost all of our school shooters have been white middle class kids.
Yeah.
That tell you something about how isolated that particular category of violent behavior is in our world. But if you don't have any other alternative, you tell your kid when your kid comes home from school with a broken nose or a missing tooth, you tell your kid, I want you to, next time that bully tries to beat you up, I want you to pick up a brick and hit him in the head. That's called violent coaching. And that's how you teach someone in part to be violent.
Mm.
So it's only reasonable that you would do that under those circumstances. It's a variation of what you're saying, which is if you go back to the time before there were large social controls over violence, then you used violence to protect yourself from violence. The old classic clan battles, the West Virginia families that were having feuds, those were ways to limit violence, paradoxically.
Mm.
Because if you attack someone in my family or clan, then my entire family or clan is going to find someone in your family or clan and take care of them. And that makes you think twice. It's one thing to kill someone who's just standing there. But if they're backed by a family that is capable of using violence, how aren't you going to hesitate a little bit before you knock them off? That's the mentality of the old form. What amazes me is that if you cut out the social controls that we have over violence, people revert to those previous systems. It's as if we carry them in the back of our minds as alternatives if all else fails.
Well, it's also something that's been, it's something, like for me, I grew up, I was born in 1990. For most of my conscious memory life, I've had access to the internet, video games, phones, and there's just a certain ability to multitask or even just hand-eye coordination that I'm sure if you did a brain scan of me versus my parents, I would probably seem like a freak of nature, but my generation as a whole, I probably wouldn't stand out. Just from, again, basic understanding of video games, just while your brain's still
Yeah,
forming,
sure.
just how many people before me, were coordinating their thumbs with their eyes. Like probably not a whole lot, right? Um, but that's a new thing. That's a learned thing. We're at the very tip of the spear of that. The internet seems eternal for me because it's been around for, again, all of my memory, but it is a flash in the pan in terms of the human experience. I think things that have been around much longer, like violence and survival using violence, that is, yeah, that's our go-to, right? That's what we go back to.
Yeah.
Is I shave every day. Very quickly though, if I'm somewhere and I don't have a razor, very quickly I get greasy, wild hair and just patchy beat, and in a matter of weeks, I start to look like a feral hog, and that's right. That is my baseline. That's what my body thinks is normal. In terms of violent behavior, yeah, when you don't have domestication, when you don't have access to food and water, and I have no reason to be violent. Probably, yeah, you do fall back to clan mentality, ride or die. You have your tight group of people, and whether or not it's that makes the most rational sense or philosophical sense or there's some moral objectivity to it, ne- you know, Darwinian evolution doesn't care about that. It's do you live long enough life to procreate?
To reproduce. Yeah.
And it's, you
Oh,
know,
and if there's no one else to protect you and protect the people you value, what else are you going to do?
you got to man up.
Medieval Europe, medieval Europe had higher homicide rates than inner city Detroit used to have.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, and I've looked at the numbers. The classic killing was done with a knife because everyone carried a knife. They ate with a knife. That's all they used for eating. Everyone had a knife. And the second most common weapon was a piece of wood, a stick, a log, whatever you could
Just
grab.
bash someone.
And I mean, if you look at the cases that came before the courts in England, which I have done, uh, you find a monk who got angry at somebody who came to the monastery or some group who came to the monastery and started hitting them with a piece of wood. And all the other monks came out and killed the entire group. And you think, what? These guys are these, really? But that's what happened. In ancient Rome, although there were courts of law, the court didn't enforce its judgments. You had to go kill the guy yourself if the guy got a judgment.
You got the
So
blessing.
Rome in those days was like the mafia. In fact, that's where the mafia structure came from. Obviously, Rome was like the mafia. You had your pack, you had your guys that you moved around with, and they protected you, and you protected them. Nobody went out at night; it was too dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so we see all this wonderful legal structure that came out of Rome, but the other part, the enforcement part, kind of gets overlooked. And of course, when there was someone who committed a real crime against the state of one kind or another, they got to go fight it out in the Coliseum against a lion or a bear or another guy or whatever. I mean, imagine the whole gang is going down to this wonderful day of sport when you're going to watch six people kill each other in teams of two.
Yeah. Even that, yeah.
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 See, people do that today. People today are starting to worry about football players.
I was about to
Boxing
say I was about to say
boxing
football.
is beyond the pale. Nobody thinks no nice middle class person thinks they should watch boxing. Boxing used to be, when I was growing up, used to be everyone's favorite sport, but it's too violent. As societies get less violent, they don't want to look at violence as much. That's another curious phenomenon. So we're
So
all over the
no, no,
subject
no,
here,
no, no. It's
and it's
when
a
it
very large subject.
no, it's odd because when there's enough food and water, and there just seems to generally be quote unquote enough, it does seem to be the recurring theme that we become more peaceful. So it's like deep down, it seems like we all want that, right? There is a reason, aside from the psychopath or someone that really revels in it. No one wants to use this stuff, right? It's even Einstein's grouping, right? It's we don't want to do this, but we're doing this so our kids don't have to do it. Even that is like, oh, that's I think that's one of the hardest things about the Masters of Death was seeing them talk about this, and it's because they love their kids, and you're like, what the hell, like the Nazis, but there seems to be something that we want to move towards peace. There does seem to be the highest idealism of some form of manifestation of one of the holy books, right? The love thy neighbor, don't kill, don't covet, don't steal. Like we want to go to that, but if we can't, we'll do the next best thing, and it's like take care of my clan, and if you got to kill the other, I'd rather it be them than
Sure.
us. It's an odd
Well,
thing.
the change really came as countries developed powerful central governments, kings in particular, and a middle class. The middle class didn't want all this violence because you can't really negotiate all the things that people in business negotiate. Imagine a modern corporation if everyone in the building was seriously violent.
Yeah.
They couldn't carry on their business.
No.
You'd kill your boss would kill you,
Yeah.
and so on. So the middle class in exchange for paying the king taxes, the middle class put a lot of pressure on the king to take control of violence. And that's where the control began. When Louis XIV moved his court to Versailles and insisted that that's where business would be conducted for the state, he required all of the nobility to leave their weapons at home. And it caused a great stink among the nobility because they were all violent people. That's how they made their living.
Yeah.
And you can hear them bitching about, oh my God, what's going? We're all pussies now. King doesn't want to, and so forth. You can just imagine. But
Yeah.
he realized if he let all these people come down there with their weapons, they weren't going to be able to do all the dealing that they needed to do.
Yeah.
They just and he that was the beginning, and it slowly trickles down to the lower classes, if you will, over the centuries. The first police force, which were the London Bobbies, didn't come along to the very end of this period. By 1800, the violence levels had dropped down to something like modern lows,
Mm,
just because courts of law had been established, alternative ways to deal with violence had been offered, and people who were living decent lives certainly didn't want to put themselves up at risk for being killed.
mm,
It all became part of that nostalgia about even the story of King Arthur and his court is mostly about pulling together the nobility and teaching them that there's a higher set of values, that they should only use their violence defensively, basically. That's what the story is about.
mm,
Against dragons and evil knights, but not against each other. So there's a whole huge history about the decline of violence in the West that I find endlessly fascinating because it didn't involve guns, it didn't involve dominance of any kind. It just involved people saying, wait a minute, we can't carry on our lives with all this stuff going on around us. And if we're going to give the king all this money, then he should control all this. And he did.
It kind of puts video games in the complete opposite light. Instead of like these kids these days are playing violent video games, it's almost like, yeah, it's what a large break from history. Where instead of killing each other, it's a formal way, right? We go into a digital coliseum, and I do it all the time with my friends. The number of like digital avatars representing my friends that I've murdered over my 33 years is insane. I've killed them a thousand times over, a million times over. They've set me on fire how many times? But it's always just it's
Yeah.
with headphones on and it's sitting with a blanket playing a video game, and we
Yeah.
never. I mean, maybe once my best friend and I have like swung at each other, and it probably had something to do with tequila, but like
Yeah.
never in my entire time knowing them have we ever come at each other for that. It is kind of
Well,
odd.
Japan has the lowest homicide rate in the world. It's less than one per 100,000. And they love violent movies.
Yeah,
They love revenge stories. It's because of those old classical values that are built into these stories where the good guy ultimately wins
mm,
a victory because he follows society's rules in
yeah,
some way. I know there are permutations on that all over the
sure,
place. That's basically the story. It's part of the education of adolescents that we encourage them to play mock violence of various kinds.
yeah,
And even this, the less violent a society, well, that's not true with Japan, but Japan's, at least in this country, we're seeing our violent sports one by one being taken away from us. Bear baiting. I always remind people that right next door to the Globe Theatre, Shakespeare's Theatre in London, the next theater down the street, physically almost identical, was a place where they did bear baiting, which means they brought in bears and had them torn to pieces by dogs or lions or whatever animal, pit them at each other and cheered them on and threw tomatoes at them, and violence against animals, which most people are revolted by today, was an entertainment then,
yeah.
and so on and so on. So we're changing continually, slowly toward the better. Even the curious phenomenon that as violent levels go down, homicide levels go down, suicide levels go up, which I take it to mean that people who are ready to try serious violence
Violence,
decide that as an alternative to having to take that risk, they would rather end their suffering under violent socialization by killing themselves. Not all suicides, needless to say.
sure,
People who are tormented in school, that's another reason. But someone who's on the violent socialization continuum has to find a way out of the dilemma of being constantly violently dominated by whoever is doing it to him in his life. I found my way out from my stepmother by going to a local community center or the library and staying away from her as much as possible.
mm,
Uh, so did my brother. And that's one way so did Lonnie Athens, by the way.
mm-hmm.
He went to the library. So there are alternatives, but one extreme alternative is suicide. And I think that accounts for this curious phenomenon of these two measures uh, reversing each other. So in fact, the suicide rate is going up among adolescents in America as the violent level goes down. These things are interesting, and this is all the kind of information that you would want if you were studying a disease.
Sure.
You would be looking for the phenomena that manifested the disease or seemed to prevent the disease from occurring, and you would be working that into an overall strategy for controlling the disease if you can, in fact, eliminate it.
And I don't mean to wrap this up abruptly. But what I was gonna say is, and I don't say this lightly. I'm coming up on the 10-year anniversary of my brother's suicide, but I do think
Mm.
about last year. I think it was last summer or last fall. there's that guy out in Colorado where they found his body in, I think, the bathroom at a theme park, and he had shot himself just before the theme park opened. But he was in, I think, the bathroom with like 1,000 rounds of ammunition, several guns,
Oh,
body armor,
yeah,
and I think he wrote a note that said like "I'm not a monster," and he killed himself. And I look at that and I do look. I almost look up to that, and not idealizing suicide, but that's someone who seems like they were at the truly at the edge. They had done 99.99% of the preparation to
yeah,
become violent and do a mass shooting, and something broke through the clouds at the very end. And
yeah,
unfortunately, instead of seeking help, they did kind of and I don't say it lightly, but the next best thing, and they removed themselves
yeah.
without,
Right.
and
That's a
that
that's a great example.
it's a
I
cocktail of
use the
emotions to
example.
take that down.
I use the example of my brother Stanley, who was 13 years old, and through circumstances that are too boring to repeat, my stepmother had decided that he is trying to poison her. And she got out her fungo bat and was starting to beat on him. And he was just old enough and large enough by then that he realized that he didn't have to take that anymore, that he could do something. And his first thought was grab the bat and beat her with the bat, which obviously would have been his initial violent, what did Lonnie Athens call it? Violent social response, something like that. Anyway, the first time you use violence that way is typically with the person who's been dominating you. But we were both in church activities. We were both in Boy Scouts. We had learned a lot about values that argue against using violence. And that came to him at that point. And instead of hitting her, which would have sent him off on a totally different
Mm-hmm.
trajectory, and me too, inevitably, he dropped the bat, ran out of the room, ran out the back door of the storefront where we lived, and ran and went down into the tunnels he lived in most of the day, the big sewer system under Kansas City, the storm drains, they're called, where he spent a lot of time pretending he was Jean Valjean from Les Miserables, and thought, is there anyone I know who would take us in? Meaning he and I. And he couldn't think of anyone. So he went to the police. And
Mm.
that began the process that let us end up at a benevolent boys' home
Mm.
where we spent the next 6 years of our lives really healing in many ways, not
Yeah.
completely, but healing. So there is another example of how you could turn anywhere along the way. In a sense, becoming violent is a matter of lack of good information because the person who's beating on you typically tells you you're going to be a wimp like this for the
Yeah.
rest of your life unless you man up and start using violence yourself. They coach you to be violent at the same time that they're using violence against you,
Yeah.
and sometimes even use the violence to force you to be violent. And so, of course, you learn the lesson, but that's not the only possible lesson.
Mm.
There's also the library or a priest or the police or
Yeah.
whatever, running away from home. That
Yeah.
other people, there's also a suicide.
Yeah.
There are lots of ways to prevent it. And that's why I'm so hopeful that if I can finally get this information out into the world in a way that people will pay attention to it, because we're so totally misdirected about violence is not mental illness. That's the latest dodge. Everyone says, well, he had some mental issues. Yeah, don't we all? But that's not the reason violent. In fact, people who are seriously mentally ill are not usually sufficiently organized even to use violence.
Mm.
And the statistics are very clear. People who are mentally ill by official designation, but don't do drugs, that's the one exception, do not have a higher level of personal violence than regular people in society. If they do drugs, they do. But doing drugs is its own category of places where you have to deal with violence one way or the other,
Mm.
either the threat of it or the risk of it or whatever. So to come back around, there is a way to deal with all of this outside of the issue of guns.
Yeah.
Guns make it more difficult because they make it easier to use serious violence.
Yeah.
But the staging process can be interrupted before you get to that point.
Um, and I think that's where we'll end it for right now. Again, I don't mean to end it abruptly, but I'm the worst boss in the world, and as my own boss, I schedule podcasts right on top of one another and think there will never be any repercussions, and daily there are. Um, but Mr. Rhodes, as always, a pleasure talking to you. I will text this episode to you, and we'll schedule the next one. I'd actually really like to continue this talk on violence and kind of the
Yeah,
lacking
yeah.
access to information. I think that's fascinating. But for right now, I got to wrap this up. Mr.
Yes.
Rhodes, thank you so much, sir. Guys, please go in the description, find his website, find the links to all of his books. If I had to recommend one, I'd recommend Dark Sun. And then if you want something that's actually probably much more scary than a hydrogen bomb, is Masters of Death, the SS Einsatzgruppen group. And
Oh,
if you want something totally different,
yeah.
go for Scientists. It's about ants. It's much better. It's much more peaceful. But for right now, Mr. Rhodes, thank you so much, sir. Till next time. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Tommy.
Yes, sir.
Recording
Guys,
Always good to
stopped.
see you.
yes, sir. You as well. Thank you for watching, guys. Peace.